Last year I became doubtful about my belief in the depth of this religion. Now, don't get too alarmed because, as my wife would tell you, this happens periodically. I have lots of opinions. I don't mind spouting off on just about anything, as some of you know only too well. But I prefer that there be some underlying principle to it. As a UU minister, I am sometimes quizzed as to what I or Unitarian Universalists believe. What is it that makes us special, or at least peculiar? I have 5-second, 10-second, and 30-minute essays at my fingertips for this. But I became emotionally dissatisfied as I realized that I missed having an essential principle, something in our values that sort of pulled it all together. Other religions have a salvation story, a tradition's understanding of the human condition and its problems, the tradition's principles for how and why living a certain way makes our lives fulfilling and useful, and they offer profound truths that demand discipline and sacrifice in the service of a spiritual quest. But you might say, what about the principles and purposes? You have the principles right here. Wouldn't it be just like me to show up and, shall we say, put in some doubt something you have right up front? Well, that is, because these are merely the result of a poll taken in 1961 when Unitarians and Universalists merged. The result of many discussion groups' resolutions boiled down and cobbled together. So, for example, they draw no distinction and give no priority to, quote, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Justice, equity, and compassion are simply listed, but not necessarily in any logical order or linked together. And a free and responsible search for truth and meaning might be multiple principles, I think you could get 4 or 6 out of them, mashed together, or nothing in particular. So without an underlying consistency, I felt a little lost because the principles are descriptive, but not prescriptive. I think there is real benefit to both individuals and groups of a consistent discipline. This leads to a spiritual reinvention that kind of rolls forward as the principles expand. Individuals gain a sense of purpose and confidence from following a religious path that speaks to their condition, its problems, and the solution. Most of the major religious traditions have a range of disciplines from mild to strict, with at least one branch that is highly disciplined for individual enlightenment. The Muslims have the Sufis, the Buddhists have Zen and others. Roman Catholics have their monastic and missionary orders. The 12-step programs have a consistent set of goals and principles, as do the Hare Krishnas. If you are lost, you can be found somewhere in these faiths. And yet, Unitarian Universalism's freedom and eclecticism are an antidote to fruitless doctrinal disputes. Battles over a scriptural word here or there sap the spiritual energy of any group. Our freedom to choose from different sources, truths that are most helpful for this time, gives us vitality and imagination, albeit with a tendency, a bit to wander around a little. Remember that old joke about the UU on the path to heaven who reaches a fork in the road with a sign that says, to heaven or to a discussion group about heaven? Well, okay, maybe he chooses the discussion group because he was not sure what, if anything, he was giving up. Maybe he just needed time to think. Furthermore, we share with Judaism the old joke, get 2 rabbis in a room and you'll get at least 3 opinions on anything. And sometimes that's as far as it goes. But we also do not throw off theological refugees from hidebound tradition, from cruel hostility, from the exclusion of gays and lesbians. We have our intellectual seekers folded within our group. The free thinkers are actually encouraged. So I was looking for a clear purpose and a flexibility. Funny, I never asked any of my teachers in preparation for the ministry or psychotherapy if they were consistent. But anyway, I began to understand that the freedom to pick and choose from off the theological book rack was overrated for me. Is there something that guides me, and us perhaps, toward greater character development, solutions to the human condition, and profound human change? Can this principle be both informative and flexible? At about that same time, I was reading The Spiral Staircase by Karen Armstrong. She sums up her life's work spent understanding the historical development of several major religious traditions in this way. You must first live in a certain way, and then you would encounter within a sacred presence that which monotheists call God, but which others have called the Tao, Brahman, or Nirvana. But did that mean we could think what we liked about God? No. Here again, the religious traditions were in unanimous agreement. The one and only test of a valid religious idea, doctrinal statement, spiritual exercise, or devotional practice was that it must lead directly to practical compassion. If your understanding of the divine made you kinder, more empathetic, and impelled you to express this sympathy in concrete acts of loving kindness, this was good theology. But if your notion of God made you unkind, belligerent, cruel, or self-righteous, or if it led you to kill in God's name, it was bad theology. Compassion was the litmus test for the prophets of Israel, for the rabbis of the Talmud, for Jesus, for Paul, and for Muhammad, not to mention Confucius, Lao Tzu, the Buddha, or the sages of the Upanishads. I decided I'd pick up this ball and try to run with it. Consequently, I am attempting to combine a dedication to universal compassion with a Unitarian Universalist spirituality. Now, there's a little thicket I need to clear out here to bring compassion into the foreground and put its synonyms in the background. Sympathy is a relationship or an affinity between people in which whatever affects one correspondingly affects another. It is a kind of emotional twinship, a likeness that leads to like feeling. Empathy is a little more at an emotional distance, meaning the identification with and understanding of another's situation, feelings, and motives. Both sympathy and empathy could cover feeling with or for another in a spectrum of feelings from ecstasy to despair. Pity consists of specific feelings of sympathy and sorrow for another's misfortune or suffering, a kind of regret that is close to compassion and arises out of the same root as piety, but also implies some moral, economic, or physical superiority, but without action. Compassion is a dual concept, empathy and stimulus to action. Deep awareness of the suffering of another, coupled with the wish to relieve it. Compassion is both feeling and action, awareness and focused response. I remember a lot of examples of compassion, so I'll just select a few. There was the time as a young man when I was hitchhiking in Europe, and I'd ended up late on a Sunday evening, so everything was closed up except for the restaurants, in Genoa, Italy, which is a rough town, down by the sea, which is the roughest part of a rough town. I sat down on a bench with my backpack at my feet, and a guy sat down next to me. He was a seaman, he told me, and we were conversing, sort of, as he said to me, in essence, in a mixture of Spanish, German, and English, what's a guy like you doing here? And I said, I don't know, and I pulled out my youth hostel book, and I said, do you know where this is? And he said, oh yeah, that's 3 miles down there. I said, whoa, is there some other place? He said, yeah, I sleep in a warehouse with about 100 other guys. I said, oh, I could do it. And he said, no, that's too rough for you. Okay. I said, so, well, I guess I'll have to walk it because I had no Italian money. He gave me bus fare. Now, this is a guy who had practically no money himself. And yet his compassion for me, not only a virtual stranger, a stranger, was terrific. He was overflowing with it. And then there was the time I wanted a bite to eat, and I went into a diner early in the evening, which was almost empty, except for an old couple who came in and also sat at the counter down in the end. And they looked at the menu, and then they tried to order, and neither one of them could speak very well at all. And the waitress spent at least 5 minutes saying, "You want scrambled eggs? What do you want?" And she just kept at it very patiently. She was the picture of compassion where the payoff, nothing tangibly, except knowing that she was doing the right thing. And then there was the young woman who had grown up in an abusive, traumatic childhood, which led her to act out with drugs, sex, and violence starting at the age of 11. 2 decades later, her daughter is in the same school she went to, and she's just received very bad news from the guidance counselor about her daughter and her daughter's ability to learn. She's walking down the corridor and meets one of the teachers that she was most obnoxious to. She's crying. The teacher opened her arms and put it around her. Beautiful. Over time, the teacher was able to reach out to her and welcome her back with compassion. So I take these definitions, I take these examples, and perhaps we could helpfully use a yardstick within ourselves that measures each impulse or decision against the knowledge of the major traditions in promoting compassion. We could say with each decision, will this promote empathy? Will I become more peaceful internally and considerate toward others? Will the effect on other life forms be benign? Will subsequent generations thank this one for our concerns? Will other people see us as helpful to them? Well, that's all very fine. But complications begin immediately. And of course, being a UU, cannot avoid those. What does it mean to be compassionate in complicated circumstances? What do we do when the objects of our compassion and the oppressors of others or ourselves are the same? For example, Glek Rinpoche wrote the following about 9/11. I admit I was angered by the attacks, even though I'm a Tibetan Lama who's been in the love and compassion business for 60 years. But that doesn't mean anger should be allowed to run out of control like a wild horse. We must put the bit in our anger's mouth and direct it so it turns into compassion. That is spiritual practice. We start by looking into our hearts and minds. The way I worked with my mind was by reflecting first on the victims of this tragedy. Having compassion for them was easy. Then I focused on the hijackers, foolish men who were willing to kill others and die because they thought they'd be rewarded in heaven. When I considered how pathetic and stupid they were to waste their precious lives, my anger at them slowly changed to compassion. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't go after the terrorists. If we don't, more people will get hurt. Stopping horrifying acts is compassionate when it's done with the right motivation, which is respect and care for all life. Even in Tibet, the home of love and compassion, we fought against the Chinese invasion. So it becomes very complicated as we mix the human dedication to compassion, meaning deep awareness of the suffering of another and a wish to relieve it, with the necessity of survival and contending national power blocks in the real world. It is not enough to say that we should reserve compassion for our immediate, close relationships, as we are always interfacing with representatives of a larger world. The fearfulness of strangers and strange circumstances that has affected our politics since 9/11 makes our ability to separate from the wider world less sure than ever. People have been arrested or assaulted just because they looked foreign, a tragic and bizarre event in a country made up largely of immigrants and their descendants. Thus, one of the components of an intelligent universalism is that all are accepted as seekers for truth. But we must deal with damage and survival issues realistically and go to conflict in defense as sorrow and self-defense contend within us. If all other avenues, such as negotiation and mutual self-help, have been exhausted, you can tell immediately that I'm not for the war in Iraq, but it is more subtle and personal than that. When in my youth, I was an aide on a psychiatric hospital's male adolescent maximum security ward. It was wrenching when we were called upon to subdue a violent patient. Yes, he was likely to hurt himself or someone else. But his pain and fear and confusion were self-evident as well. And he was also likely to misunderstand being restrained. It was very painful to wrestle someone to the floor I might have been chatting with just half an hour before, that I might have joked with a little and listened to his problems a little. This speaks to the equality of people implicit in compassion. As a non-creedal religion, Unitarian Universalists, like Baptists and the Society of Friends, among others, hold to a belief and practice in the priesthood of all believers. You see this in many ways. The personal sharing after a sermon is an example of lay people being equal to the minister, but having a say in the service. Lay-led summer services and program groups are examples of everyone participating in preaching and ritual elements. We open up many memorial services to contributions from those attending. Some other traditions, like the Methodists, require lay preachers to go through extensive training before they may preach. Roman Catholics will allow a nun to preach, such as members of the Dominican order, but only priests may administer sacrament. This is orthodoxy. By contrast, UUs adhere to orthopraxy, right practice, and may designate an interim minister or other person to do a wedding, say just as the Quakers do. This is more than a sweet nicety. Revelation of spiritual truth is open to all. Any one person is as likely to have a valid insight as someone else. Every person has an opportunity to voice his or her views. The only reason I limit this to people is that chimpanzees, hedgehogs, and carrots do not speak a language I understand. But they may have good insights. The priesthood of all believers is essential for universal compassion. Consistency requires that all people, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, color, etc., may provide a valid insight and may be mistaken in order for compassion to be fulfilled. It is not out of partisanship but equality that UUs support gay marriage. For over a decade, the UU Service Committee worked to lessen prison incarceration rates through a deep awareness of suffering and a move to help it. But compassion is not just for the other. It is also for ourselves. Once we have begun to limit the sources of beneficial truths, we have limited the profundity we can attain. At the beginning of each fall, really the new year, the Hastings congregation begins our congregational dedication to all the scriptures, humanist, Taoist, Muslim, Hindu, by acknowledging the sacred writings of others. We do this because it is to our spiritual benefit to do so. Whereas others see their discipline and consistency in their limits, in their orthodoxy, we have it in our openness. Of course, we also bring our reason and feeling to the views we have, but we may find as we consider an insight that it is limited and helpful in other ways. We may try a meditation technique or a discussion method and discard it. But our discipline lies in the rigor with which we accept our personal responsibilities to check it out, to test and experiment. Thus, we are called to be gentle with ourselves. The shame and guilt of some other traditions are not at home here. Not that we don't have it, but in my clinical practice, I am repeatedly struck by the difference it makes. that my theology does not demand of people that they feel badly about themselves in order to change. I do not see the need for them to confess their sins to be healed, as other traditions would have it, to turn or to repent, but that they feel loved in order to have the emotional fullness that makes change possible. My acceptance of them may be instrumental in their seeking it from others or recognizing it from their past. That empathy that we are giving to others we owe to ourselves as well, as deserving of the respect whereby we try and fail and try again. I saw this recently in a client who battles profound mental illness. She was sinking into a painful, self-critical depression despite her best efforts. Repeatedly increased and augmented medication were not enough, and several therapy sessions per week, even with me, was not enough. She brought her husband in, and she and I did all the fancy footwork, dancing about how she can change her approach, both cognitively and behaviorally, and where this all came from, the insight, the psychodynamics. But I knew I was losing this fight, and she was losing it faster than I was. I finally got really plain-spoken with her and pointed out that her husband loves her. Her children, I've seen all of her children briefly at one time or another. Her children love her. I knew from what she told me that her siblings love her. And her religious congregation loves her. Her husband concurred in all of this. I asked her if she could accept that love and really take it in. It was then that she smiled wanly and said in relief, "I think that reached me." Thus, the orthopraxy, or right practice of compassion, means that all are potentially included in our deep sympathy for others' sufferings and attempts at relieving it. If they, through their violence or intransigent hatred, reject our efforts, we are not compelled to force compassion on them or to submit to their transgressions of our rights, but we are obligated to respond to any indication on their parts that they have had a change of heart. We are also tolerant of our own efforts and failures. That is an intelligent universalism, and in its wide-ranging nature, a particularism as well, because we do not simply tolerate others' views, we engage in dialogue. That is truly compassionate. Discussion after the sermon, the pervasive decentralism and democracy of our movement, the emphasis in our religious education of helping children form their own views in light of reason, feeling, and received truths. All of this is a process supporting dialogue. We are allowed to speak, we are compelled to listen and respond. No other religious tradition is so strongly responsive and inclusive. Our responsiveness may be internal, such as a receptivity to the stones that were put in the jar over there, or external, such as the sermon discussion. But it is expected. It is also implicitly expected here that people of all ages have something to say. So we hear from young people, and we respond, and I saw you do that today, enthusiastically to them, thus incorporating them into the dialogue. It is also not incumbent on another that they change to join us in order to be accepted. They, whoever they are accepted as themselves. In sum, it is the many forms of compassion that lead us to consistency, not in belief so much as in practice. The orthopraxy of compassion is how various it may be from moment to moment and year to year. The orthopraxy of compassion is in constant dialogue to widen the reach of empathy and the desire to help others combined. So, thank you.